everyone to NoRCEL Sessions. NoRCEL Sessions is a project supported by a network of of researchers and chemical emergence of life. And every month we invited a speaker to talk about raw topics in biology. And in this month, in this edition, I have a pleasure to introduce Dr. Fabricio Rodrigues to talk about the human evolution in American continent. Fabricio, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Please share your screen and go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Savio, for inviting me. Thanks, NoRCEL, for this wonderful initiative. Thanks, Miriam, Sohan, everybody listening now. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Is it working?
Yes, Fabricio.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
Can I start then? So, yeah. So we are going to talk about the emergence of human life in the American continent. So this is a research field that I've been working on since the 1990s when I did a PhD working in human Y chromosome diversity. So trying to understand human Y chromosome variation and try to figure out what was the main path of people migration leading to the occupation of the American continent. So I have this talk trying to summarize much of our work, but also trying to make a consensus between different historical disciplines about the pre-Columbian settlement of Americas. Of course, we have a bias here because I talk mostly about our work, but also putting together some recent evidence that with very interesting claims that are making much more clear this scenario of occupation of the Americas. So when we talk about the American continent and American indigenous people, we are talking about these guys here. So we have different morphologies, different types, different languages, but all of them have some common morphologies, common behaviors. Of course, there is a huge heterogeneity, but also a common shared history. I'm going to talk about this. We have our outline of presentation. First, I'm going to talk about human natural history and the scientific reconstruction methods that we use for this purpose. And then I'm going to show some of the hypotheses for the pre-Columbian settlement of Americas. Then I'm trying to do some integration of evidence in the genetics and morphology field. And at the end, I'm going to try to convince you about a possible scenario, consensus scenario about this late settlement of the Americas. So when we are talking about human natural history, we are talking about people, and particularly about indigenous people. And we have a huge variation. All of these guys here in South America, most of them are in Brazil, very different language families. They have many languages as different as Chinese and Portuguese. And so we have a huge cultural and biological diversity. So we have people in different human landscapes, deserts, mountains, forests, savannas, all different landscapes occupied by these different people who adapted in terms of biology, in terms of culture as well. So we also have access now to a lot of data provided by the archaeologists. So we have many of the human bones that were collected here in Americas in the last century. And these samples can be used now also with genetic approach. So I'm going to talk about them. And we have also the archaeological tools and other kinds of evidence that we can use to put together all of this information concerning the history of the settlement. So when we are talking about the scientific reconstruction of the human history, this is a multidisciplinary initiative. And so I'm geneticist. We work with DNA, and In biology, we also work with phenotypes. So particularly for human history reconstruction, we use the skulls or other parts of the bones that can be compared between individuals, between populations, and try to figure out a common scenario explaining their migration towards the continent. So we have now a pretty good general history. I'm not going to talk about the general settlement of the ancient world, no, or the pre-Columbian world, this world where most of people, the ancestors of the native peoples of the continents, they arrived particularly by foot. No, they have not used any particular transportation means except some very primitive boats or small vessels that they could navigate through coastal waters, but they couldn't use boats to go crossing the oceans. No? So I'm going to talk about this history, that we have a common scenery, talking about an origin of Homo sapiens around 200,000, 250,000 years ago in Africa, and occupying the other continents in the last 7,000 years. So what we have is a scenery that puts the American continent as the last continent occupied by these populations. And these populations are putatively related to the Siberian populations in Northeast Asian continent. So, but we can also add other information, cultural information, as you can see here on the right, with arrowheads, many different tools, ceramics, and other different types of tools that can be used also to reconstruct this history. But we have here another different kind of reconstruction that's based on cultural artifacts. The cultural data is quite different from the biological, because much of the cultural evidence is actually a product of horizontal connections. People not only learn from their ancestors, but they also learn with their neighbors. So it's a bit different from DNA, that most of the DNA that we have and we compare, they are inherited from the ancestors. There is no horizontal transfer of DNA, at least between human individuals. No? So in genetics, we work mainly with genetic data now produced by genomic methodologies. In genomics, we all need to have access to DNA samples that is stored in human tissues. Now, if you have modern people, you can get easily samples from mouth swab, blood, and if you have ancient people, you can have from teeth, from bones, and we need a DNA splash. We need to construct the DNA libraries, genomic libraries, and to sequence. And after sequence, you need to figure out the alignments of the sequence and the variation contained there that represent the individual and the history of his ancestors. So based on this variation that we gather with genome methodology, we can do many different analytical approaches. I'm not going to explain that, but we have a phylogeography approach where these balls with different colors, different populations, they are connected by branches that are actually mutation steps, and the connected ones means that they are the same family tree, for instance. It's a kind of genealogical approach that you can connect the previous genealogical history and geography, because the colors represent people located in different continental spaces. We have phylogenetic trees, a typical tree for just connecting also genomic data of individuals or populations. We can do analysis of population splitting, PCA graphs that we have here, that we can compare populations and individuals from different communities, different continents, and we can have population structure methods that you have many different individuals represented here. Some individuals are, for instance, completely red. This is a very thin line that we have here. There are 1,000 individuals represented in this graphic. And in this analysis, we try to understand the past genome configuration of the assess that contributes to the individual analyzer. This is a kind of analysis that I'm going to show more in details in instance. We also have modeling tests that we can try demographic scenarios. We can imagine different ways of occupation of the continents that were occupied by people who came here and they were standing with no expanding population. But for instance, for Americas, we have a scenario that we test usually a population that arrived around 15,000 years ago and suddenly expanded to a very large number of population. Actually, when Columbus arrived in Americas, the expected census size of the population was around 20 to 50 million people. It's a lot of people that were occupying America by that time. You know? We also have genetic landscape that is a kind of analysis that's considered the landscape they have, for instance, try to understand what the Andes caused like a barrier separating populations, so provide a connection between population at the top of the Andes. There are many ways to analyze it. And the final is the reconstruction using demography. So I've been coordinating a very ambitious project between 2005 and 2015. In this project, we were trying to understand in general terms what were the major migrations leading to the population of the South America. So we have many hypotheses derived from archaeologists and linguists. It is a linguistic scenario that we have here. No, talking about people who arrived in white arrows, arriving about 15,000 years ago, giving rise to many hunter-gathering populations. And in more recent times, around 6,000 years ago, we have the farmers, the Andes, the Arawaks, and the Tupi indigenous group that were groups of farmers that have completely changed the scenarios in South America, because when they are farmers, they have a lot of food, they can settle, they can have large populations, and they need to migrate, they need to disperse, they need to occupy other lands. So the Andes occupied all over the Andes. No, it is estimated that only in the Andes there were around 20 million people occupying the Andean mountains. But, well, in this project, we have focused mainly in the history of some local populations, for instance, the history of the Urus. These are the indigenous people who occupy the Titicaca Lake, the largest navigable lake in the world, in high altitude in the world, about 3,800 meters above sea level. No? They have these villages that are floating villages, and they occupy several parts of the Bolivian and Peruvian sides of the Titicaca Lake. And we in this study, we were trying to show that they were the original settlers of this Andean region. They were never farmers, but they were subjugated by the later farmers who arrived there in the Andean region that today speak Quechua and Aymara language, for instance. We also work with these guys here, very intelligent, the Chancas, the Chanca descendants that were supposedly the Lamistas from Upper Amazon of the Peru. We have worked with the descendants of the Inca family. The Inca were actually not the people, but the monarchs, the kings of the empire that dominated all over the Andes. The largest empire in South America. So these are some examples of focus, historical focus in particular histories that are in test. But now I'm going to talk about the whole settlement of Americas. We are talking about the early people, the first people arriving to the continent. So we have many hypotheses talking about the occupation of Beringia, this area that was soil because the ice level, the sea level was 120 meters below what we have today. So huge soil was connecting, part of soil was connecting Bering, la part of Northeast Siberia and Alaska, making a kind of land bridge. This land bridge was allowing people arriving through the interior, and there is a hypothesis that they have, after arriving in Alaska, they could migrate south through ice-free corridor between these two ice sheets occurring in Canada. But there is also a hypothesis that they have migrated through the coast using very small boats, so some intermittent field camps, and they have migrated through the coast towards the south until the southern tip of South America. And according to many human ecologists, this would be a very fast occupation method. If you have a kind of coastal ecology that you can extract your resources like plums, or like fish and other marine resources, you can just, using small boats, easily come from the northern tip in Alaska until Terra del Fuego. It wouldn't take more than 1,000 years. So it would be a very fast movement. And from there, they could occupy also the continent. So there are many hypotheses. We have new ideas today. I'm going to talk about, this is the land bridge that is simulated according to calendar years in the past. So we have here the level of the sea increasing and forming what we know today as the Bering Strait. So, but about 20,000 years ago, it was very different because of the last glacial mass. And we have the idea that these people coming, they were different ecologies. So the people migrating inland, they were likely megafauna hunters. They were hunting mammoths, they were hunting large bisons, different beasts that are still today. And the people coming through the coast, using the Pacific coast, they should be coastal explorers, people who would know how to gather food in this kind of marine environment close to the coast. And it is these are two different approaches. Actually, you can have both of them, people that have different kinds of ecology and ways of living and getting the food. And in the year, about 20 years ago, we had a model that we have analyzed Y chromosome data. This is from the pre-genomic time. So we had, I'm not going to detail all of this, but using methodology concerning about studies of phylogeography, a connection of genealogical lineage, we could estimate some dates of particular Y chromosome lineage occupying the Americas. And we had a common scenario that could accommodate both dispersions into Americas, the inland corridor and also the Pacific Coast corridor. We estimate about initial settlement around 18 to 15,000 years ago. So this was a very interesting time because we could put dates, we could imagine migration scenarios. And this was repeated by different researchers worldwide. For instance, these are two studies using mitochondrial DNA that were also get the same results, that the initial settlement was compatible with the migration through the coast, through the inland corridor. And this population was small, so there was what we call a founder effect. A founder effect where a small number of individuals give rise to hundreds, thousands of individuals after some generations. And interesting, these are very recent data that we're trying to date the opening of the ice-free corridors. So what we have here in this graph, on the right, we have the blue dates concerning the the Pacific Coast Corridor. They are older than the opening dates for the inland corridor, the ice-free corridor in the continental part of North America, particularly in Canada. So what we know now is that in terms of data that gathered by geologists, these archaeologists, the Pacific corridor was opened in much earlier time than the corridor that we had inland. So these are other studies showing the same thing, and they confirmed that the Pacific Coast Corridor was opened about 18,000 years ago, and a very recent paper that analyzed details of this evidence, they concluded that there were two time windows that were much more likely for the people crossing the glaciers from Alaska towards the northern part of North America. So between 24 to 22,000 years ago and 16 and 14.8 thousand years ago. So because of the scenarios, we are much more confident about the possibility of people migrate to the coast. But there are other different aspects in this history. For instance, morphology, that was also a challenging point, because since the 19th century, there were some ideas about the first people that were found, particularly here in Brazil, was a famous paleoanthropologist, Peter Lund, and Peter Lund worked in the region of Lagoa Santa. He found lots of schools, about 30 schools, and 15 in a single cave. And these schools, they had a different morphology from the typical Native Americans today. And he also published some ideas that these ancient people were living together, megafauna beasts, for instance, like giant sloths and mammoths and other of these large animals. Was the first researcher to put the idea of the people living together, large animals. So imagine this, that it was before Darwin, it was before people accepting evolution as it is. So it was a major challenge to convince people about this joint occurrence of people and extinct beasts. And these schools were different, and they were actually submitted to many studies. This is a famous fossil from Brazil about 12,000 years ago. And this fossil was reconstructed. And unfortunately, because the museum where it was located got fired, and so we have just pieces of this. We tried to analyze this burned piece, and we couldn't get any DNA out of it, so it is lost forever, I think. And these schools, like the other Lagoa Santa schools, they were reconstructed many times like native Australians or Africans because of the morphology. But this is a very wrong interpretation, because actually the morphology of them is a kind of morphology that was very common everywhere around 12,000 years ago. If you go to China, everybody in China had a morphology like this, so there is no point to say that was a people like what we know now as Africans. It's simply because it was what you call a plesiomorphic morphology, or primitive trait morphology of these schools. And most of people share the same kind of school, that is dolichocephaly. So this, for instance, is a reconstruction of a very similar school with the same measures found in Nevada, United States, and the reconstruction is completely different. We have analyzed this, so we have a paper from 2008 just analyzing the morphology, and we have, for instance, the non-Mongolized or the typical dolichocephalic schools here on the left, and here on the right is the typical Mongoloid type schools that they have flat face and other kind of changes in structure. And the Eskimos, for instance, are the ones that have a more how can I say, Mongol type schools. that we can find in Americas. And what we have is actually a gradient, a climb of different school morphologies. There is no clear separation between them. So what we have for many other traits, morphological and genetic traits everywhere. So we have analyzed put together the genetic information and try to make an integrative consensus, integrating archaeology, morphology, DNA, and try to make a common scenery of human evolution in Americas, where you have the morphology typical of Lagoa Santa people changing through time, leading to current people that has what we call a Mongoloid type morphology. So, and more recently, we have added other evidence from fossil bones. So these are data produced with ancient DNA by two groups from Copenhagen and Harvard. And they have similar results, but they have independent sampling. And our group work with full genomes, while the group from Harvard, they use what we call just 3% of the genome was sequenced in this case. So the different types of data, but they produce similar results. And this work we have compared with many different data of modern and ancient people spread all over North and South America. And we could make a common scenery of occupation that we talk about an ancient occupation around 15,000, 16,000 years ago is the red arrows here, leading, for instance, to Lagoa Santa, to the people in Tierra del Fuego. And these people, they have changed through time. For instance, around 9,000 years ago, these yellow lines here represent a gene flow of different characters that we think that signify that it means that new genes that were changing and also allowing to change the morphology of these people. So the morphology that we see today is a kind of in locus evolution of people that's related to the evolution of the Mongoloid people also in Asia, because they have connections, they have gene flow as well. So they have transfer of genes from one side to another. This is another work by my PhD student, Thomas, the first one here. So working only with full Y chromosome data, full Y chromosome genomes. So we could also sequence some ancient DNA, but also many modern Y chromosome data from different indigenous groups. And we had a model very similar to the previous one, but in the Y chromosome, we could identify different lineages, 4 different lineages. What we have here is a major lineage that's called QM3, that is represent about almost 90% of all Native Americans. This is the represented what we call the major founder effect of the Americas. But we have also some 3 minor lineages that represent less than 10% of other Y chromosome lineages found in Native Americas. So interesting because in this picture here on the right, we have what we call the Iberian standstill. Is the time when this population, they could not cross the ice, so they were diverging in Beringia. So we have made some dates between 21 and 17,000 years ago, where these people had a window of differentiation in the Beringia continent that was a very good climate during the Pleistocene glacial times. So these people took a time before crossing to the southern part of North America. So these are just another way to see this information, the 4 major lineages of Y chromosomes. And interestingly, is that when we go to Latin America, particularly South America, what we see in the Y chromosome lineage with different colors here, they are very restricted geographically. And these lineages, they originate around 12,000 to 14,000 years ago. So what we have now in South America, according to the Y chromosome, is that we have a very early structuration. It's like the people who arrived there about 14,000 years ago, they settled and they stayed mostly in the same area. Of course, not all of them, but many of them represent people who stayed adapted and they occupied parts of the South America very early on. It can show here is a new paper by Ornella Semino group from Italy, where they show they have revised all data, including other published data, and they show the same thing. Some lineages, like here in green, that have a restricted geographic distribution, and other ones. These are all people connected, for instance, for some mutations. This is a particular genealogical group. They are all Native Americans, and they have somehow restricted distribution. That was like a portrait of early structuration during the occupation of South America. So we have some remarks about this. We have, for the Y chromosome 4 found in Y lineage, this lineage QMA48 is the one that we observe a population expansion that's represented like this, about 14,000 years ago. The early diversification in Beringia, what's called the Beringian standstill, is between 21 and 17,000 years ago. And the chromosome diversification using modern and ancient DNA data suggests two anachronic entries south of the glaciers, out of Beringia. So this is supported by many studies, including one published in 2019 that was comparing Asians and the first people of Americas. So, and we have a scenario that explains also the gene flow from one side to another. And this gene flow could also bring together some new traits of the Mongoloid type morphology of the school. So, for instance, the Paleo-Eskimos, which are ancestors of Eskimos, they are derived from this ancient migration wave about 5,000 years ago. So, and they have a very Mongoloid type school, a morphology, a school morphology typical of what we would like to call Mongoloid type. So when we try to integrate the scenario, so we have morphology, DNA, and archaeology, and climatology, you know, we can see the people of America as two major times. The Pleistocenic people, that is the initial people where we occupied Beringia. This initial time finished about 12,000 years ago with the end of the Pleistocene. And these people have migrated southward using a Pacific route or an interior route. The Pacific route is using the coast, so they had to use some small boats to cross some parts of the coast. And the interior, they need to accompany the bees and hunting, because it was a very rough corridor that they need to cross. And the second time is the Holocenic gene flow. Is when the ocean level increased up to current levels. And we also had a gene flow, a migration of people between America and Asia, as we still have today, because some Eskimo populations, they cross back to Siberia. There are Eskimos in Asia as well. And this Holocenic gene flow may be related to the changing morphology that's common between Asia and Americas. So these two anachronic routes, the inland route and the Pacific coast route, and they are anachronic because the Pacific coast was open much before the ice-free corridor in the middle. So it was open only about 13,000 years ago, and 18,000, this corridor was open in the coast. And what we see in the recent publications, that people are trying to integrate this formation with archaeology and paleoclimatology. Everything is put together, and we are having more and more integration of this scenario. This is a paper published by archaeologists where they consider the genetics to integrate the information they also produce. So we are getting closer to a common scenery that was very difficult. If you talk about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was almost impossible. Different disciplines talk between them about the settling of Americas. So for instance, we have now many other publications put together, archaeologists, geneticists, linguists. This is a publication by a colleague of us, two Brazilians here, Tabitha Runemeyer and André Staus from the University of São Paulo. They joined the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and they publish ancient DNA data of the sambaquis. Sambaquis are typical archaeological sites of the Brazilian coast. So they have very nice sampling of some individuals that almost 11,000 years ago, for instance, the Luzio is one, is about 10,400 years ago. And when they compare the genomics with F4 statistics that compare ancient data and other genomes from modern populations, for instance, these individuals that are typical morphology of Lagoa Santa, the non-Mongolic morphology, they match populations like the Chavante. The Chavante are typical modern indigenous from central Brazil. So there is no clear separation between these ancient people from 10,000, 11,000 years ago and people from today, despite they have different school morphologies. There is a continuity of populations from the past to now. So it is what this analysis is proposing. We have no difference between the ancient and current population that would suggest they were different people, that the first one went extinct, and so you had other people coming later that replaced the previous one. So we don't have this scenario. That what we have is a continuity of people occupying South America at least for 12, 13,000 years that we have with morphology. So these are the people who actually did the work, the students, postdocs, and several collaborators in different countries, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, in Brazil, in Denmark, in England. So we have many collaborators anyway in the funding we have from different kinds of agents. So thank you very much.